Low Teens, the 2016 album by the band Every Time I Die, is sort of an accidental masterpiece. What I mean is that sometimes a work of art is constructed deliberately from the ground up towards one consistent artistic vision, that artistic vision being a loud, powerful statement. But other times, a work of art just so happens to coincidentally be a loud, powerful statement without necessarily being the result of a deliberate effort towards one artistic vision. Low Teens sort of fits into that latter category. The way I understand art is that aesthetic and execution are not incidental to theme, and in fact, are vital components to how theme operates in art. By that, I mean that if you're going to make a statement through art, the best way to go about doing this is to make sure that how the art looks, feels, or sounds is based on what the message is going to be. Sometimes you can do this in a symbolic sense, like how the Residents' Gingerbread Man album uses repetition in the music to simulate the repetitive motion of a gingerbread man forever being chased after. Other times, you can do this in a more contextual sense, like how Kendrick Lamar pulled from genres that have a prominent history in black culture on his album To Pimp a Butterfly, which featured themes about black culture and black empowerment. Sometimes you can do this more directly, by having a song with sad lyrics sound, well, sad. Having a deliberate vision and executing the vision in the way that best facilitates the original concept, I think is a great way to approach deeper levels of artistry in any medium. However, this isn't actually necessary to create something deep. Sometimes the stars just have to align. Sometimes the art is just a right time, right place sort of scenario. Low Teens is one of these cases. Every Time I Die's history as a band has been that they've played a mixture of southern rock and metalcore. And when I say a mixture, I mean a blending of both into one consistent sound. Each album they experiment just a little with this formula, but for the most part, each album contains a few different elements. A mixture of metalcore and southern rock sounds, a mixture of clean singing and screaming, and lyrics that are kind of convoluted and pretentious, but also always very personal and very self-depreciative. All of these elements are played off for fun, making Every Time I Die almost sort of a party band. Low Teens has almost all of these elements. It is, in fact, a mixture of metalcore and southern rock. It does contain both clean singing and screaming. The lyrics are convoluted and pretentious while still being very personal and very self-depreciative. The major difference here, however, is that it's no longer fun. Instead, it's tragic. Every Time I Die's career path had inadvertently set them up to make a true masterpiece of an album with Low Teens, because all of the elements that typify an Every Time I Die album happen to work very well with the deeply personal and tragic context that the Low Teens album exists in. In order to understand why this album is a masterpiece, that context needs to be explained. That context is that shortly before making the album, the singer of the band, Keith Buckley, had to abandon a tour because his wife had a pregnancy complication with their firstborn child. The child was born premature, and there was a significant possibility that his wife and new daughter wouldn't survive this health issue. Keith wrote the lyrics to reflect on this situation and where he was in his own life, and how this situation changed the way he viewed life, himself, and his position within his family. It is, in this sense, somewhat tragic of an album, cataloging a man at his most vulnerable moment. A work of art is not always deep because it's smart or clever or thought-provoking. Instead, a work of art can be deep because it's heartfelt, and that's what separates Low Teens from most albums I've ever heard. It's just so devastatingly heartfelt. The rest of this video will discuss two topics. First, I'd like to analyze the Low Teens album start to finish in order to discuss the meanings of certain lyrics and how the music helps aid this meaning. And second is to discuss the culture of music reviews surrounding the time frame in which the album came out, and why music reviewers utterly failed to really assess this album properly, at least from my perspective. Alright, so let's jump in. First, I'd like to make a disclaimer. This album will be talking extensively about Keith Buckley as a person as presented through this album. Thanks to the whole death of the author concept, I have to clarify that this is my interpretation, and anything I say about Keith should not be a reflection of Keith himself, but only of my interpretation of his statements on the album. Since this is evidently a very personal record for Keith, I want to recognize that and say that I don't mean to disrespect the situation or Keith or his family at all. The album is also pretty personal to me for different reasons, which I will get into. The first track on the album, Fear and Trembling, sets the tone for the entire album in part through its music, and also in part through its lyrics. Both music and lyrics evoke a certain mindset that I think really puts the listener where they need to be in order to understand the album. That mindset is nihilism. The first time I heard this album, the intro on guitar was utterly off-putting, and at first I didn't like that about the song. But I realized later on how important that off-putting intro is to establishing the tone of the record. Having this stilted rhythm and somewhat sloppy-sounding playing, in part due to the low gain, starts the listener off in a state of discomfort. The pinch harmonics in particular just sound bad, but as an intro it does the best possible job of setting the tone for the album. The rest of the song is almost doom metal, being a slow song start to finish that helps keep this consistent tone of being stilted and somewhat broken sounding, keeping well with the tone of the lyrics. The lyrics to Fear and Trembling take us seemingly straight to the very end of the chronology of the album. Weirdly enough, the lyrics both serve as an introduction to the concept and emotions of the record, but also serve as a wrapping up of everything that we haven't even heard yet. The very first lyric not only establishes the tone, but also summarizes both the theme and the semi-story of the album. I say semi-story because while the album is inspired by real events in Keith's life, the lyrics are much more about the internal reflection and response to these events, and don't really serve any direct storyline in the lyrics. This opening line is one of hope but also fear, and that's a duality that presents itself repeatedly throughout the album. The situation is dire, but the feelings of love it inspires is so much more powerful than the fear that comes with them. He's telling us as listeners that a major theme of this album and of his experiences will be a contemplation of death, and how it can hurt us and scare us, but can't break us. The triumphant statement that death cannot tear us apart is one of reassurance and, at first glance, confidence. However, these lyrics are then undermined by the rest of the song, which is very much about being torn apart. What makes this line more powerful than anything, though, is that it's not only the first line in the song, it's also the last. After all of the rest of the lyrics of the song, covering a very hopeless-sounding nihilistic tone, here he is to remind us again that death cannot tear us apart. What makes this repetition so powerful to me is that it almost sounds like he's trying to remind himself. Like he's making this confident statement that death cannot tear his life apart, because on some level it may be possible that he himself is having a hard time believing it. He's scared that death can tear his life apart, so he screams this line at the end to try to keep himself on the hopeful side, while it becomes all too easy to descend into nihilism and hopelessness. The rest of the lyrics cover the situation with his family mostly through metaphor, but the other line I'd like to talk about is this one.
I am sorry, it's not right, but you were mine to sacrifice. I was hopeless, I was tired, and we all killed to survive.
It's this hopeless, tired, kill-to-survive mentality that characterizes the sort of nihilism that the album opens with. We're all weak enough at some point to hurt others in order to preserve our own well-being. This idea that desperation can change someone, can make them hurt you, is about as nihilistic as it gets. This isn't literal, of course, it's more a reference to an emotional state. The situation he's found himself in with his family evidently makes him feel cold, distant, yet guilty. To project a bit, maybe he feels like he was responsible for his family's health scare, and this lyric captures the fear that comes with desperation. Maybe life, maybe love, doesn't mean anything when it still leads to loss. This becomes the theme of the album later on as well. If there is a chronology, I imagine that Glitches jumps all the way back to the beginning. I've heard somewhere that Glitches is about the 2015 Paris attacks at the Bataclan Theater. This is sort of the start of a long winter in 2015 and early 2016 for Keith, who wrote the lyrics during that winter. That winter was the same winter that his family had such a traumatic scare affect all three of them, and the album's title, Low Teens, refers to the wintertime and how the temperature was often dropping into the low teens. Glitches isn't going to be particularly relevant to this video, except that the last lines take on almost a double meaning in the context of the album.
My fault, but godless! My fault, but godless! My fault, but godless! My fault, but godless! There's no need to panic! No need to panic!
These lines are in reference to the Bataclan shooting and his own reaction to it, saying that he cares but that he doesn't have remotely the courage to do anything about it, and feels weak in the face of such tragedy. He also is screaming at himself there's no need to panic, another case of trying to reassure himself in the face of depression. The double meaning, of course, is that these lyrics also apply to his situation with his family, trying to reassure himself that things are going to be okay, while almost certainly too weak to be able to believe it. C++, Love Will Get You Killed, is where the album really starts to pick up in full when it comes to the story, themes, and emotions of the record. This is one of my favorite songs off the record, and one of the most direct songs on the record. Before I dive into the lyrics, I'd like to read an interview with Keith Buckley that he had with Billboard about the song in question. Quote, "When I got there, they took me to see Lindsay, but she was unconscious and hooked up to a bunch of machines. None of the doctors knew what happened. All they could do was monitor her vitals. She couldn't talk because of the tubes, so she just wrote words with her fingers on my arm. Scary was what she wrote first. I had never felt so hopeless. I could do nothing for her. I couldn't tell her that it was going to be okay. I couldn't even tell her that death wouldn't be better because I had no idea yet if our daughter had even made it. I kept asking doctors what the machines meant, and eventually I could tell they were sick of me asking so many questions. I realized that if I could only understand what their beeps meant, I might have some hope. I might have some answers. I didn't know what I was doing or exactly how it was working, but writing lyrics at night and feeling like I had made sense of some of my confusion gave me hope. I would take that hope into the hospital rooms. We would get more good news. I would go back to writing lyrics with confidence. Confidence made me hopeful. The record healed me. It kept me strong from my family. People can say it's a coincidence, but they weren't there. I know it was something more." The lyrics to C++ are extensively about the night that he found out that his wife was in trouble. I see it as sort of a two-part song almost, with Petal being a sort of part two. C++ is directly addressing his wife, and Petal is directly addressing his daughter. We'll get to Petal, but for now, C++. The lyrics are kind of brilliant to me, because the vocal performance really helps contextualize the lyrics and the emotional state that Buckley is in. The vocals start off with clean singing for the first time on the record. Usually when Keith starts doing clean singing for the first time on the record, it tends to be on the third or fourth song, and it's used to capture a sense of ironic self-destruction. He's tearing himself down and singing it in a way that portrays it as fun, yet bitterly sarcastic. Instead, here, the clean singing symbolizes something completely different. It's meant to be more calming and relaxed, and the irony isn't so much humorous as it is tragic. The opening of the song is Keith trying to assure his wife that she's not going to make it and that it's okay because death won't be so bad. Meanwhile, the lyrics slowly descend into panic as Keith tries to calm his wife in the event that she doesn't pull through. In a sense, he isn't really trying to keep her calm, but trying to keep himself calm. Internally, he's freaking out, but he wants to be calm and collected for his wife. He slowly starts to lose it, and the vocals help contextualize this. He screams every first lyric for the opening, implying some level of panic even when trying to be calm, and then he starts to scream, and by the time we get to the middle section, Keith is literally trying to plead with hospital devices to tell him that things will be okay. Okay, so first, before I dissect individual lyrics to the song, I want to provide some personal context. I have panic disorder. I've had to deal with loved ones dying, as well as loved ones being near death. One day, for example, I walked out of school to find out that my mom had been hospitalized because of a health complication. When I went to see her, she was not in a good condition. Her eyes didn't even seem to be syncing up, as though one of them was lagging or had temporarily died or something. Having panic disorder and having these kinds of experiences, I can say that C++ perfectly captures both the tone of having a panic attack and the thought process. When in a dire situation, my mind's first instinct is to try to find some way to make it okay, and when I can't, my mind tries to find some way to make sense of things, and this only makes my emotional state worse because I start to rationalize my worst fears as though I deserve them. In particular, death causes panic attacks for me, and I choke up every time I hear this song, because trying to calm someone down for the horrifying experience of death is just too much for me to handle.
Stay if you think we could pull through. My curse is the strongest there is, and karma collects what is his.
This lyric is pretty hard to handle, in part because of personal experience that I'll share later. The idea that her survival is not only dependent on good fortune, but being able to fight against the cosmic force against them is a pretty powerful statement. The curse obviously isn't literal, but in a situation like this, it could very well feel literal, that he deserves to have the love of his life ripped from him, either because of bad luck or because he deserves it for just not being good enough.
I'm trying to bleed with your machines. I'm in the feet
This line, "tell me anything at all," hits me really hard because he's not asking for reassurance. He's asking for anything at all. Because right now he feels like he has nothing. No certainty, no hope, nothing. And he just wants to know anything more than what he has now. He explains it in the interview, but the idea that he's literally trying to plead with hospital devices to help him make sense of what's going on is pretty haunting.
If it's a false alarm, then forget what I said. If the snake won't bite, then I'll take it all back. If there's wine in that bottle, then bring me a glass. I'll eat crow and don't taste so bad.
The way that Keith sings these lyrics is that he's screaming it with a melody. It's a very loud, tense moment. This is when he fully succumbs to panic. He's trying to bargain with his situation. He still doesn't know if she's going to pull through or not, and this part implies that he really wants to believe that things are going to be okay, and he's willing to sacrifice anything about himself to save her, including his dignity and pride. Nothing matters in this moment other than some sign that he's wrong about her potential death. I know the feeling all too well.
When everybody gets a universe, they do what they want. I'm gonna need another universe that tore me apart.
So this needs a tiny bit of explaining what he's talking about. Here he's referring somewhat to solipsism, the idea that everything outside of yourself is a projection of your perception, rather than actually existing. That's not what I believe in, and that's not what he believes in, but solipsism is a means of understanding the world. We don't all inhabit one universe together. Instead, we each inhabit our own filtered, individual perceptions of that universe. These individual perceptions could be described as each their own universe. In that sense, universe is just a synonym for life. We each get our own little universe of experiences, and his has been destroyed. More importantly, he feels that he destroyed it. This is a form of hyperbole that gets into the experience of a situation like this. In my personal experience, whenever these kinds of things happen, I'm always left thinking about anything I could have done that would have prevented it. I could have talked to them, I could have checked on them, I could have bumped into them on accident and changed their trajectory just slightly. Anything about my world could have been slightly different and I wouldn't have to lose them. The instinct to feel like it's our own fault when tragedy strikes can sometimes extend far beyond the self into the world around us. Keith doesn't just feel like he endangered his family. Instead, he feels like he tore his entire world apart. One thing that really helps contextualize the song's emotions here is the music. The rhythm and melody imply an almost marching theme to it, feeling less like a rock song and more like a military song. This march evoked, in my mind at least, a march of death. That sort of constant forward momentum mixed with a more somber quality makes it feel like things are endlessly moving towards a darker place. This feeling matches the lyrics perfectly, where the lyrics are about an increasing amount of panic and uncertainty with the lingering possibility of death. The music is almost fun in the typical every time I die sense, but something is off about it, and that off feeling is what really makes the song work so powerfully. As a listener, you want it to make sense and be digestible, but it never quite gets there, just like the situation that the music represents. Two Summers is the first time on the record that the lyrics and music start to look a bit more optimistic. Two Summers jumps ahead in the chronology to a point that seems to be a lot later in the situation. I won't get too far into this song, except to mention that the song seems to be about his relationship with his wife, and also his relationship with alcohol. The incident that inspired Low Teens is also the incident that inspired Keith to eventually give up alcohol, I believe. Alcohol plays a major theme throughout the album, as a prominent force in Keith's life that became an issue at such a crossroads moment. The general theme of Two Summers seems to be that Keith thinks his wife should leave him, or that he doesn't deserve her because of either this incident or just where his life is in general. He repeats the phrase, "I ain't in your crystal ball." The song sort of captures the classic "Every Time I Die" irony, but not quite, and feels mostly sincere, saying that he doesn't feel like he has a place in his wife's future. All in all, this song is one of the songs that is more hopeful, and that's reflected in the music as well. Awful Lot is another song without much to talk about. It's mostly just Keith reflecting on his life and his past, and how this situation with his family has inspired a sort of depressed nostalgia.
Why can't it be the year 2000? I wanna live in the year 2000, when I was dumb enough to truly believe. Why can't it be the year 2000? I wanna live in the year 2000, when having nothing meant having everything.
This is in part a reference to his career, I believe. Every Time I Die formed in 1998 and released their first album in 2001, with their first EP being released in the year 2000. So in a sense, his entire career path would be unwritten if he went back to the year 2000. He's saying, essentially, that given the situation he's found himself in, he wishes he could reverse time back to when he was naive and hopeful and had the whole world ahead of him, because it would be better to undo everything he ever did than to experience the pain he's in now. That's another major feature of panicking in such an intense situation, wishing we could remember how it felt when things were okay, because we're so far from that point that it feels like nothing but a distant memory. I Didn't Want to Join Your Stupid Cult Anyway is, quite appropriately, the only song on the entire album to capture the typical irony that Every Time I Die exercises so frequently on previous albums. This song is downright fun, but despite this, is one of their most bitterly sarcastic songs in the entire catalog. I can't read too far into the song, but I imagine that the cult isn't literal, though it could be. Regardless, the song comes across as Keith trying to turn to some sort of outside force to wipe his mind clean so that he doesn't have to experience this intense anxiety at where his life is led. Being able to just hand your entire being to someone else and let them take care of it for you is a temptation that I've also experienced in moments of desperation. And so despite being the only song that's really fun on the album, the context of the album surrounding it makes it come across as more pathetic than charming. That's intentional. The main point of the song is that Keith is calling himself pathetic for his eagerness to avoid what other songs might suggest as a sort of accountability that Keith sees in himself for his family's near-death experience. As a last side note, the section where he keeps repeating the phrase "drink up" is a fun play on words, where he's simultaneously referring to alcohol and to drinking the Kool-Aid, turning the song into an ironic take on a party, where the impressionability of listeners to hear "drink up" as a means of encouragement is instead twisted into a cult-like chant towards self-destruction. Given the themes of alcohol throughout the album, I imagine this lyric was in part self-deprecation. It Remembers is one that I don't really have much to say about. The music is important here. The song is their most overtly bluesy song in their entire career, being one of only 2 songs with no screamed lyrics at all, the other being Two Summers. There's 3 lines in particular that I want to highlight, though.
I still howl like an animal in the darkness, and I'm reminded by the blood on my clothes. I can't stand what I've become. I'm shivering to spite the sun. We come together and we're overwhelmed by the loneliness.
The reference to blood on his clothes is a metaphor for his perceived guilt at this situation. Going back to Fear and Trembling, Keith described the situation as kill to survive, and here he's referring to his feelings as though he violently killed something like an animal. When he says, "I can't stand what I've become, I'm shivering despite the sun," this part hits really hard for me. One thing that's really powerful about Keith's lyrics, and about some of the best lyrics in general, is that he'll coat his lyrics in a lot of metaphors, but at a choice moment, he'll drop all pretense and just speak directly. After a song with a lot of metaphors and imagery, he just lays it out straight. I can't stand what I've become. This line of shivering despite the sun is a great sort of visual that says more indirectly than needs to be said directly. When I hear it, I think about the sun as a source of light and warmth. It's something that reveals you, but also comforts you. And Keith is saying that he's rejecting that light and warmth. Perhaps he's afraid of being comforted. He's afraid of being able to see himself. To me, the lyric captures how extreme guilt can manifest into spite. This feeling that when people are able to see you, they might hurt you more than you could hurt yourself. And since extreme guilt can cause paranoia, at least in my case, I start to lash out at others in order to protect myself from being hurt even further by the overwhelming feelings of guilt. In that sense, spite is an extension of fear.
I thought I settled my debts that night on the ride home, but I still got hell to pay.
One thing that I really love about lyrics that work, and one thing I try to approach my own lyrics, is putting the listener into a time and place, both physically and emotionally. Here he's referring to the ride home. It's never made clear what ride home he's referring to, but it reminds me of the drive he had to take to the hospital when he first found out his wife and daughter had a health complication. He drove overnight, endlessly to make it to them so that he could be there for them. And that's what I picture when I hear that line. I picture being scared, tired, at night, in a car, on the way to see someone you love who may not even pull through. Just being there for them won't be enough. This lyric also perfectly segues into the emotion that starts the next song, Petal. In my mind, we're on the road to the hospital to see what happened. This puts It Remembers at a sort of mixed chronological point, where it feels like it sort of leaves off right on the road to seeing his wife and child in the hospital for the first time. He thought once he got there, everything would be fine. But instead, we see what happened next. Petal is by far my favorite song on the record, and is possibly my favorite song of all time. It's one of the only songs in my life to actually make me cry, and for good reason. Following from C++, Petal is extensively dedicated to his daughter. Petal is simultaneously the most loving and most dire song I've ever heard in my life. Musically, Petal is the perfect counterpoint to It Remembers. It Remembers is sad and depressed, but calm. It's one of their softest songs, and Keith sings the entire song in a refrained, depressed, softer voice. After something calming, Petal quite literally sounds like an alarm going off. The dissonant tones, the rhythm of the entire song, the way that it begins with just a slightly quiet electric guitar and then explodes. The music of the song implies on its own, wake up, the nightmare is only just beginning. And this is reflected in the lyrics perfectly. The song opens with Keith describing every detail of what he sees and feels as black. The line that hits me really hard here is, her eyes when open are black. He could be referring to his wife, but given the rest of the song, I imagine he's referring to his daughter. The idea of looking into your own baby daughter's eyes and not being able to find hope in that is really fucking intense to stomach, but the song has only just gotten started. The main premise of the song is that Keith, reflecting on the possibility of losing his child and wife, is contemplating suicide.
What if meaning never comes? And I was just someone to fuck. All of life beginner's luck. What becomes of all creation if the smallest prayer is finally answered no?
The sort of what if question is hard for me to process, because I'm a very optimistic person and very hopeful that things will work out, but I've been in a position where things didn't work out, or where I was at a serious risk that they wouldn't. Keith is looking for meaning in this situation, in his life, in his relationship to his family, and he's having a hard time finding it, and he's starting to question whether it even exists at all. He's saying, what if our time together was just meaningless? What if everything I wanted us to be together dies?
The greatest of the floods. There's a vacuum where the brightest future was. I better warm up my gun in case love is not enough. I better warm up my gun in case love is not enough.
These last two lines hit me hard. The way that his voice softens when he says there's a vacuum where the brightest future was implies so much love for his daughter, that she had a whole life ahead of her and he isn't seeing anymore. It's not there. Instead, there's nothing. He loved her so much and now he's scared he might lose her, and that fear isn't a scream so much as it is a gasp. His biggest fear is expressed in this third line. Love might not be enough to prevent this from happening, and he's not going to be able to live knowing this. Now this next line, there's actually two sets of lyrics happening simultaneously, and one is way in the background. But I want to highlight the background lyric because it's a powerful one.
What haven't I done? What have I done? What haven't I done? What have I done? What haven't I done to deserve a cold war on all sides and something all the time?
That phrase, sometimes silence is all silence is one of the most painful lyrics I've ever read in my life. The ability to put you in a time and place and evoke all of the emotions within it makes me genuinely choke up. That phrase suggests that the quiet space of waiting to see if his family will pull through, in that quiet space, he wants to believe that it's some sort of positive sign. Perhaps the still small voice of a Holy Spirit, perhaps the distant hand of God reaching out, maybe the auditory and symbolic silence of this moment in his life means something. Or maybe it's just silence. Maybe he really does have nothing. Sometimes things just don't mean anything. Sometimes things just aren't okay. For these next lyrics, I'm just gonna play the entire rest of the song so you can really hear the moment uninterrupted, because I think it's very important.
First, I need to save the life of God, so that God can come and save me from myself. If I have to walk alone, I'm giving up. I can't stay here knowing love is not enough. If I have to walk alone, I'm giving up. I can't stay here knowing love is not enough. I'm timely ripped into this world. I was born again as a girl. I'm timely ripped into this world. I was born again as a girl. I'm timely ripped into this world. I was born again as a girl. I'm timely ripped into this world. I was born again as a girl.
The line that first made me cry was, "If I have to walk alone, I'm giving up. I can't stay here knowing love is not enough." This line totally broke me. In terms of his situation, the idea that his family will die is going to kill him, and he means that literally. If they don't pull through, he will end his life. Not because of the feeling of guilt or the feeling of responsibility. It's because he doesn't know how to live without them. He doesn't know how to make sense of life if love can't conquer death. Going into the record, I already knew the context of his life, and I expected, given his usual sense of irony and self-deprecation, that he was going to talk about how awful he is. But here he is, in Petal, dropping all of the pretense and just admitting that he loves them too much to be able to handle losing them. If that isn't the most real fucking feeling ever put on a record, I don't know what is. The last line, "Untimely ripped into this world, I was born again as a girl," means, in a literal sense, I had a daughter. On its own, that doesn't hold much meaning. In the context of the lyrics of the song, in the context of the music and the vocal performance, this lyric takes on a very intense feeling that otherwise, in the literal sense, would be fairly mundane. It's the way he frames something mundane that makes this last line so powerful. It's reflecting on the feelings of the rest of the song. All of this horrible nightmare of self-doubt, self-destruction, and self-loathing, fearing for his own life, fearing for the lives of everyone who matters to him, it's ultimately all surrounding one thing. He had a child. What makes this especially powerful to me is that after talking so extensively about himself and his own feelings on the situation, he ends the song by making it not so much about himself but about his daughter. Despite all of the nightmare and tragedy and fear, he has a daughter now. Ultimately, beyond these feelings, that's all that matters. It's a sort of fearful, distressed gesture of love, that this is a nightmare, but it's all a nightmare that comes with being a parent. Another thing about this ending that really sells all of it is his voice. The thing about screaming in music is that it's often seen as almost antithetical to powerful emotion in songs. People tend to think that a sad song needs to be sung softly, with soft music. Petal is the sound of sadness at its most panicked and fearful, and it's reflected in his voice. His voice isn't powerful. He isn't screaming with confidence. He's screaming with panic. You can hear it in how he shreds his voice in these last few lines. He not only sounds frail and panicking, he almost sounds drunk. There's no strength here, no aggression. It's just pained and weak. The entire song sounds like he's in a drunken stupor and pushing himself to the brink, and these last few lines sound like a man at wit's end, and it helps the lyrics greatly in impact. Lastly, with Petal, I'd like to discuss some personal context. So, I'm a daughter. Interestingly enough, when I was born, there was a health complication that could have possibly killed me. The birth also affected my mom's health possibly for the rest of her life. In that sense, this sort of nightmare scenario of a baby being born the wrong way is one that happened to me. Growing up, I had this looming sense of guilt over it throughout my life, feeling like I had messed up my family's life, like I had torn my family apart. Not only did my being here contribute to significant financial difficulties for my family, but I also was a huge emotional burden growing up. My fucked up birth was, for me, interpreted as sort of symbolic of what my existence meant, just a near miss from complete catastrophe. Growing up, I felt fairly distant from my father for a number of reasons, but listening to Petal made me think about my own position within my life, and hearing Keith talk about how he wouldn't be able to survive losing his wife or daughter made me think about my own dad, and how it must have felt for him when I was born in a somewhat dire situation too. Hearing Keith speak of such love and fear makes me feel like maybe my dad cared for me more than I gave credit growing up. Hearing the song, I think, was helpful in allowing me to grow as a person by helping me understand what it felt like to have me in their lives. Scary at first, sure, but much, much better than if I hadn't pulled through it all. The Coin Has a Say immediately turns the album around with something much more hopeful. That said, it's an interesting choice to follow up Petal with this song, because the tone of the song is very mixed. One of the major themes of the song is, I'm okay, but only just barely. It's sort of like you would think that after such a downer like Petal, the next song would elevate the listener into a much safer position, as though the hard part is over, so the rest should be easy. The Coin Has a Say says, instead, that even though the hard part is over, that doesn't mean the rest will be easy. Drawing from personal experience, Petal and The Coin Has a Say as back-to-back songs reminds me a lot of my experience with panic attacks. At first, a panic attack goes to a 10 out of 10 on the emergency scale, where I'm right about ready to end my life or significantly hurt myself, and I stay there for quite a while. What happens afterwards is it starts to slow down just a bit, but then it ramps back up with a second attack. The second attack is never quite as painful as the initial impact, more like an aftershock effect to an earthquake. The Coin Has a Say is that aftershock effect, feeling like another emergency, but one that's a bit easier to handle. It's fitting, then, that the lyrics start as such.
I feel alright, but I'm buried alive. Nothing's healed, just covered by time. I wanna pray, but I think I'm possessed. Constant cardiac arrest.
Here, Keith is saying that he feels a lot better, but he's still stuck in a very dire situation. That feeling like he might be okay even if things aren't is a sort of bittersweet feeling that characterizes this song in general. The main theme of the song is essentially, things aren't very well right now, but my family gives me hope to keep on living.
I'm standing in the way again. I can't see the road ahead. I have taken too much. Once a ladder, now a crutch. When all of it is closing in, stop fighting and hold your breath.
I love how here he talks about the same uncertainty as before, but in a more relaxed manner. He describes things as closing in, as though floods are taking him under and he could try to resist or he could try to just let the floods take him. He's telling himself to stop trying to prevent it and learn to survive in spite of it. The panic that was all over Petal is the very fighting that he's asking himself to stop doing. He's saying, things aren't getting better anytime soon, so stop trying to fight it and just learn to survive it.
Now that I'm yours, discover me. Now that I'm yours, unbury me. Now that I'm yours, amaze me. Go ahead and save me. Go ahead.
I love this lyric from a poetic standpoint. The first line of the song mentions him being buried alive, and when he says, discover me, the implication seems to be discover him in a romantic or even sexual sense. That now that he's with his wife should explore him in a relationship sort of manner. But this is given a double meaning when he then follows it up by saying, unbury me. He's not saying discover his body in a romantic sense, but discover his body in a, I've been buried alive and I need you to find me before I fucking die sense. The undermining of a supposedly romantic sentiment is a clever bit of wordplay.
Don't take it back. You're all that I have. A new goddess emerged from the mist and took the blame from my wrist.
Here he's talking about either his wife or his daughter, or possibly both, referring to them as a goddess in a loving manner, and saying that they came into his life and helped prevent him from hurting or even killing himself. Essentially, he's saying, you gave me hope, but I'm scared that I'll lose that without you.
I will aimlessly wander this wasteland, guided only by a sickness, not a purpose. I can't go back to what I was. Metallica
This last part got some notoriety for that line about Metallica, but first I'd like to talk about the line before it. I will aimlessly wander this wasteland guided only by a sickness, not a purpose. This part is interesting because he's saying that his life isn't guided by purpose or motivation in the positive sense, but in the negative sense. He's just barely hanging on, trying to survive, and the only thing that's keeping him moving is that he's deteriorating and needs to get to a better place fast. That line, I can't go back to what I was, Metallica without the drugs, is seemingly funny at first, but to me it's actually a really emotional line. First of all, that phrase, I can't go back to what I was, is such a direct line. Another example where Keith drops the pretense and just speaks directly. The usage of the word can't there creates a sense of urgency, that going back to what he used to be, he wouldn't be able to survive it. Then the Metallica reference. For those who don't know, a lot of people have argued that once Metallica quit using drugs, they stopped making good music, and some have gone as far as to say that Metallica's drug use is what allowed them to make good music at all. Metallica went from being one of the most respected bands in the heavy metal scene to being one of the least respected, seen as more of a joke than anything, most exemplified by the documentary Some Kind of Monster. He's saying he can't go back to being pathetic, vulnerable, and uncreative. He can't lose his creative spark because he used to be there, and he's scared he might end up there again. And his creative spark is one of the only things keeping him from the kind of nightmare he found himself in with the song Petal. Religion of Speed is largely one of the most positive songs on the record, and the song isn't something I can go into much detail with, other than to say that I think it's about his life as a musician, and how his legacy as a musician will be determined by how much he gave to his fans and to the scene, rather than who he was as an individual or a person. He's saying that his music will be much more powerful to his legacy than the life he actually lived, or the feelings he actually felt. Easily one of the more uplifting messages in the album. Just as real but not as brightly lit, in 1977, continued the streak of being more positive. And if I were to figure out a sort of chronology to the album, these are around the end, near the time where he started to pick up confidence that things will get better. These songs contain negativity and uncertainty as well, but with it comes a sense of power and positivity that the rest of the album didn't really have up until The Coin Has a Say sort of turns the album around. Then, map change. After the album finally starts to pick up steam and turn to a more positive frame of mind, map change ends us on exactly the same fearful uncertainty and hopelessness that characterizes a song like Petal.
What I need is a cigarette, no more prayers.
This line gives me chills, because it showcases Keith's ever-growing anxiety about the situation. He quit smoking before the release of their 2014 album From Parts Unknown, and is saying that all of the positivity and hope from others isn't working. He just needs a vice to help him calm down, because he's tired of hope keeping him hanging. This imagery is pretty intense in that it takes his emotional situation and, like C++ before, puts it in a more cosmic context. The planet's unaligned in the sense that the universe stopped making sense, things stopped working. The brief moment where things were proper has stopped. They're stuck there without something to look to for comfort.
I assure you that hell is not a myth. We both vacation there. Hell is not a myth. We spend each winter there. No one can prepare.
This stanza is one of the moments in the whole album that hit me really hard. The line, I assure you that hell is not a myth, is such a scary thing to hear. I'm not a spiritual person myself, but spiritual concepts can take on an eerie quality when used as a metaphor for an emotional state. He's saying that he's seen hell, and it's very real, and it comes in the form of losing his family to a pregnancy complication. This is one of the only times in the entire album where he showed a single shred of certainty about anything, and it's that he's been through hell.
The glory I had witnessed was just a sleight of the hand. These hearts cannot be salvaged. These bones cannot withstand. I have either been forgotten or I was never seen. Now I'm in the negative space between.
This moment talks about the hope that he had experienced with having his first daughter, being removed from him by this situation. His life has fallen apart and now he's stuck in a state of nothingness, with only more nothingness in any direction.
I've weighed down the earth.
Again, he frames his emotions on cosmic terms, like a comet crashing into the earth, forcing everyone in his life to bear the emotional brunt of impact. Repeating the phrase, I've waved down... Again, he frames his emotions on cosmic terms, like a comet crashing into the earth, forcing everyone in his life to bear the emotional brunt of impact. Repeating the phrase, I've weighed down the earth, he feels so strained with his voice, as though he himself is being weighed down by all of the pain of this situation. Almost losing everything that matters to you, I imagine, would be a pretty hard weight to carry. And I've been in a similar situation in my own life where things just weren't making sense, and everything was falling apart with no signs of improvement for an entire year straight. When it feels like the earth is crashing, it's hard sometimes to not feel like it was you who was doing it. And capturing that feeling with such a big metaphor, I think really sells how it really feels to be in such a state of desperation. The song and album ends with a fade out. This was intentional. The band has stated that they wanted the song to feel like it was building up to nothing, and so the song fades out. This really helps sell the emotional statement of the record for me, because it reminds me of conversation. Having had conversations with people, I always feel like certain conversations reach the cusp of something really powerful and personal, but never quite get there. Sometimes when someone you love is in a bad state, you can reach out and things get better and you resolve the situation through conversation. Sometimes that just doesn't happen, and a conversation doesn't so much resolve as much as it just ends. Words just stop being said and you both leave having felt some sort of connection without any particular lesson being learned. We like to dress up reaching out to others as a sort of virtuous, grandiose gesture of goodwill, but sometimes reaching out turns into just being left to think about what was said without a deeper endpoint being discovered. Low Teens feels like an outpouring of emotions, where rather than ending with some sort of resolution or lesson learned, it ends with a faded whimper, simply too exhausted to keep talking, and it leaves the listener wondering where things go from here. To me, that's much more powerful than any simplistic morality tale, because we grow as people when we learn from the situations with no clear answer, and the moments in which we don't succeed, but instead barely avoid falling apart completely. Ultimately, the album is simultaneously the band's biggest triumph and sort of a rock bottom. It captures the feeling of rock bottom so perfectly that I can't recommend it enough. The music captures the subtly gloomy yet overtly panicky feeling of losing everything all at once, and the lyrics contextualize this in the most loving, sincere, and heartfelt way. What makes this album a masterpiece is that the format they had created for themselves helps facilitate this message perfectly. The irony of a song like I Didn't Want to Join Your Stupid Cult Anyway, the self-destruction of a song like Petal, the pumping up catharsis of Religion of Speed and The Coin Has a Say, these things were all there in previous albums, but the personal tragedy and very heartfelt reaching out in a moment of vulnerability to people who are in an even more vulnerable state means that this isn't just an album about sound or thought, but feeling. It's not deep because it's brilliant. It's deep because Keith said things that meant everything to him. This was his means of pulling through, his means of being able to survive trauma. That's so much more important than a list of criteria about whether or not the riffs were catchy enough or the screams intense enough. And this is where I'd like to talk about the context surrounding Low Teens. The album, to me, is a masterpiece because it meant everything to the people making it, and they poured their hearts into something that really shines through in how the album turned out. It's a man exposing his most vulnerable, dire state to the world as a reflection of who he is and where he is. It's so deeply personal that it almost transcends just being a metal album, instead being more of a statement. The problem is, music critics aren't really equipped to handle this. This is because the way that music criticism operates lends itself well to devaluing meaning in favor of aesthetic. Every review I saw of this album said it was pretty good, but that it either wasn't enough like some other band or was somehow a sign that the band was stagnating musically. These kinds of criticisms are total nonsense when compared to the album's ultimate point. The album is extensively about meaning, and people just aren't used to expecting much personal meaning from a metal album. By contrast, rap artists have often been given this kind of credit, with plenty of rap records being seen as works of art for their ability to combine personal, political, and social anxieties into a statement that really represents who that rapper is, and where they are in their life. I'm intending to do a video on Kendrick Lamar in the future, as one example of a rapper who has gotten a lot of credit for his artistic intent and how well that shines through. But in metal criticism, it's almost all about technical details. I mean, that's often how criticism works. When you're trying to give a record a rating out of 10, you have to have some sort of objective measure that can be verified in terms that resemble a rating system. How do you measure emotional response? How do you measure artistic intent? How do you measure the personal, intimate details of a man's anxieties and the grief and tragedy that inspired these anxieties? It's one thing to critique an action film for not being very exciting. It's another thing to say the same of David Lynch's Eraserhead. Looking at Low Teens on the basis of its riffs or production is like looking at Eraserhead on the basis of its action sequences. You're just categorically missing the point. And I fear that Low Teens' strength as a record will be lost because of this categorical mistake. Low Teens isn't meant to be a fun metal record. It's a statement of purpose and a statement of heart. That isn't something that can be measured very easily. And when people try to measure it anyways, rather than seeking to understand and find resonance with it, we see people totally overlook the power that art can hold. For me, the album is downright perfect, and part of that is sound and production, but the biggest part is what the album means to me. As reviewers, people aren't expected to develop a personal relationship with the record. That's fine in some cases, but this is an album that's all about a personal relationship between lyricist and lyrics, and he put it out there so that others can find some value in that as well. It was his coping mechanism, and he shared it because he hoped it might help others as well. It definitely helps me in my life, and that's just something that I fear is going to be completely lost. This isn't an album for everybody, but it also isn't an album that can be properly assessed via a rating system. It's something that has to be felt, and either you feel it or you don't, but I felt it pretty strongly, and still do almost a year after its release. It's easily one of the top 5 greatest albums I've ever heard in any genre, and I recommend it to everyone, though if it's not for you, that's fine. But respect where it's due. This album is one of passion and love, and that'll always mean something to someone. It sure means a hell of a lot to me. Thanks for watching.